In a previous video, we looked at how to use CSS Grid to both lay out different portions of your website and web page, and also the overall page layout as a whole. So in this video, we're going to talk about how we will use a feature of CSS called media queries to conditionally apply those layout changes based on the size of your browser window. This will come in extraordinarily handy for doing things like designs for mobile devices and making sure that the same set of HTML looks as good on a mobile device as it would on a tablet, as it would on a browser. So let's look at how we're going to do that. So previously, when we talked about layout using CSS Grid, we were specifically looking at this element, which was called, which is a div with the class of wrapper. And just as a refresher, if we look at the HTML for this, we have an outer div with the class of wrapper, and it wraps 4 direct children. So we've got the header, we've got the main, we've got the aside, and we have the footer. And all of that is contained one level down from the wrapper. So because of that, we're able to set display grid on the wrapper, the parent container. We're able to declare 4 equal size columns, and then we are able to place the header on that overall grid that's part of the wrapper. We're able to place the main, we're able to place the nav, we're able to place the footer on that grid. So that's all well and good, but if we get down to a narrow size, then things kind of start to look pretty bad. If we're looking at a screen size that is close to a mobile device, this layout doesn't work anymore. So what we need is a technique to conditionally change the layout based on the screen size. And we're going to use something called media queries to do that. So the anatomy of a media query looks like this. First, you type the @ symbol, then you type the word media with no space between the @ symbol and the media. Then you add a space, there's a set of parentheses, and then in the set of parentheses, we're going to put the conditions under which we want our CSS to apply. So in our case, we're going to say min-width, and I'm going to pick an arbitrary screen size here, so I'll say 768 pixels. And then outside of the parentheses, we have an open and close bracket, and then inside of those brackets is going to be all of the CSS that we want to apply when the screen reaches a minimum width of 768 pixels. So let's just do a really basic thing here. So we'll select the header using an element selector, and we'll say background light blue. Now, what this is saying is that once the screen gets to a minimum width of 768 pixels, once it hits that point, change the background to light blue. You'll notice that currently we still have that kind of pixelated pattern in the background of the header. But if I open this up and we keep getting bigger and bigger, once it hits that 768 pixel mark, that CSS that's inside this media query here takes over and it becomes light blue. So let's use that same approach to adjust our layout. So I'm going to take this rule for the wrapper, put that in there. I'm going to get rid of the width and the max width because that does not need to happen when we hit a minimum width of 768 pixels. But I am going to leave the stuff in here about grid. And then I'll come up here and I'll just take that out of the basic CSS. So that means if the, I do need to have the margin in here. So if the screen is below 768 pixels, it's just going to have these rules. So we'll have the width 95%, max width 1080 pixels, and margin of 0 auto. So you can see that that stays the same. But only once the screen gets to 768 pixels will we have the grid applied. So let's kind of see what that looks like. So I move my window down, and you can see that the layout has changed. The aside is now below the main, the footer is down at the bottom, and the header is at the top. We don't have that separate right column over here in the right side of the window anymore. And that's because we've explicitly said if the browser window is below 768 pixels, there is no layout applied. There's no grid rules. But once it gets over 768 pixels, then we're going to set display grid on the div of the class of wrapper. And we're going to set up those 4 columns in that gap. So As we expand this out, you can see once we get to a certain point, that layout changes and it takes on that sidebar. Really anything that you want to do with CSS, you can do you can change in a media query. It may make sense to you to change the font size if the screen is below a certain size or if the screen is above a certain size. But in many cases, you're going to be making changes based on the layout. You're going to make layout-based changes depending on the size of the screen. So that's how you write a media query, at media, and then in parentheses, the conditions that you want to check for in changing your CSS. So in our case, once the screen gets to a minimum width of 768 pixels, then we're going to set up the wrapper, the div of the class of wrapper to be display grid. And that way, we have one set of HTML that functions efficiently across multiple screen sizes. So it has a layout that is better for it on mobile. It has a layout that is better for it on desktop. And that's all through media queries. We can take this just one step farther, and you can see here how our navigation links start to kind of stack up on top of each other at a certain screen size. So let's go and find this nav list, and we'll take that out of the basic CSS, and we'll put that inside the media query. So now we have navigation that's stacked on top of each other on small screens, and then when we get out to a larger screen, then it lies out into that horizontal format. So that's media queries. Use them for layout, use them for whatever seems appropriate for your design, but they're incredibly important. And using media queries in this way, where you set up a minimum width, means that you will start your development with your screen at a small size. You'll write all the CSS for this screen size that makes it look good, and then you will slowly expand your screen, and you'll look for a point at which that design starts to break. And once you find that point, you'll write a media query, and you will change the CSS to make the design more effective for a larger screen.